Hello and welcome to the Connecting Africa Digital Week, brought to you in association with the 20th anniversary of AfricaCom, the largest tech and telecommunications event on the African continent. In this webinar, we're analyzing the African regulatory landscape and the policy regulation approaches building connectivity on the continent. And we're pleased to have with us today as our keynote presenter Nomonde Gongxeka-Seopa, an independent researcher who also works at the South African Communications Forum. Nomonde holds a master's degree in ICT policy and regulation from the University of the Witwatersrand and has over 25 years' experience within the wider media space. She has worked with broadcasters such as the SABC and MultiChoice Africa, as well as media development NGOs. In addition to this, she serves in the ICT Forum Disability Chamber under the South African Department of Telecommunications and Postal Services. Thank you so much for joining us, Nomonde. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for this opportunity and greetings to everyone who's participating on this platform today. Well, know that we are living in an era of unparalleled digital disruption, an era of the Internet of Things, an era which is experiencing what is currently being termed the fourth industrial revolution, with massive technology-driven changes and huge innovation. And what we know for certain is that technology is at the heart of everything that we do. Globally, Africa has the fastest growing digital consumer market. And what we know is that digital technology is spreading fast, unparalleled speed, and it has an impact on everything that we do. And what we also know is that digital markets are uneven. Knowing that we have barely 50% of the world's population with access to the internet today. When looking at digital commerce, it still contends with cash, and these are the statistics that we actually got in 2013. What the statistics tell us is that 85% of the world's transactions are still actually in cash, even though the world is making a transition towards e-commerce. We are still, when you're looking at the African continent, we're still lagging when it comes to internet access. And the reason for this is because what we know for a fact is that the internet access is still lagging across the continent, and this is due to the high costs of internet access, and these costs, they continue to become a limiting factor to usage. However, there's enthusiasm for technology, which is boosting growth, and we know that we have more than 600 million mobile users, and these users are more than what we have in America and in Europe. When looking at Africa again, is that internet access, the access path is predominantly via the mobile devices. Almost everyone has got a mobile device. However, we must also be aware that the fact that one has a mobile device does not mean that people have got access to smartphones. Currently, we have about 226 million smartphones, and basically, when you're looking at it, we have more people having access to mobile phones than to a toilet, when also looking at developmental challenges that are confronting Africa as a continent. And what this mobile revolution is telling us is that it is actually able to stimulate industrial development across the continent. Today's digital landscape also tells us that internet infrastructure consists of, across the continent, international submarines, international satellite links, and copper. And then the backbone of fiber networks, we have over 1 million kilometers of terrestrial fiber which has been installed. However, what we know is that growth in local internet infrastructure is speeding up, but the deployment has largely been focused on capital cities. What we know is that, and what we're experiencing is that when there's laying of infrastructure, most people who are investing in infrastructure layout, they tend to want to focus in urban areas vis-a-vis rural or peri-rural areas, and this remains a challenge. Now, the question we want to know is why technology matters. Why should we even be fussing about this technology? We know that technology is an enabler. It can aid and enhance economic and social education development. We know that technology has got the ability to improve people's lives, foster economic growth, and create many, many opportunities. Gains in operational efficiency, cost and reduction, and quality assurance. All of this is made possible by technology. Digitization drives quantum leaps in performance. And with the fourth industrial revolution, we know that it will fundamentally shape the competitive landscape and bring about fundamental change to established industries. So going forward, or what we're currently experiencing today, is that it is no longer business as usual. Many companies are reviewing and relooking in terms of how they are doing things in order for them to remain competitive and also for them to respond to the needs of their audiences or their consumers or whoever consumes their product. So overall, ICTs have an impact on social and economic development that goes beyond the ICT sector itself. So ICTs is not for people who work within the ICT sector. ICTs have got an impact in everything, in all the ecosystems, be it education, be it health, be it agriculture. Now, what is this digital planet all about? What does it actually look like, and what does it present to us? The internet remains a pervasive and fundamental part of our daily lives that continues to deliver massive economic and social benefits around the world. 29% increase. There has been a 29% increase in internet connectivity over the past 5 years. However, that having been said, we still have some 4 billion people, which is more than 55% of the world's population, who remain off the grid, meaning that they remain offline. Now, the biggest challenge for many governments is that of closing the digital divide, which remains huge, complex, and is multidimensional. We also have the other challenge, which we call the triple challenge of poverty, challenge of unemployment, and a challenge of inequalities. We also, when looking at the continent, we have a big, huge population size, and governments are struggling to respond to the daily needs and the demands of these big, huge populations. And while governments are trying to ensure that their citizens get online, there still remains barriers into that internet inclusions. And these barriers, they range from infrastructure, affordability to use the services, the skills actually to be able to utilize the technology itself, and sometimes just the awareness of knowing what is available out there. And, the cultural acceptance of the changes, that things are being done differently, and also the relevant local content. The content that's available out there on the internet, does it resonate with the people who are meant to be consuming it? And the reason that people are not responding to that content, is it because they don't understand it, or is it because they simply do not identify with the content that is actually online? Now, integration and adoption of emerging technologies can be a cost endeavor given Africa's lagging infrastructure and disabling business environment. And finally, inadequate investment and development in core infrastructure and engineering capabilities remains a biggest challenge for the continent. And this cuts across different industries, be it telecommunications, be it transport, be it energy, education. And now, borrowing from some of the statistics which were produced by the World Economic Forum, they tell us that as we speak, from an infrastructure perspective, 15% of people around the globe have got no access to electricity. 31% of people live outside of 3G coverage. The second challenge is skills, awareness, and cultural acceptance. What we know and what the report tells us is that 15% of adults are considered to be illiterate, which means let alone them not being able to utilize the digital technologies, they just have illiteracy challenges. They simply do not have the capability to read or write. And then we know that women up to 50% are less likely to be connected. And there's many reasons for this, because traditionally and maybe sometimes culturally, women are expected to remain at home and not become active participants within the economy or go to work. So if they remain not part of the technological developments or evolving societies, they will remain outside and not be aware of all the changes that are taking place. Hence, their likelihood of remaining unconnected. Affordability is another challenge, because we know that 13% of people live below the international poverty line. So, 29 countries in which broadband was actually available for the full 100% of the population, one's household income are taken into account. So what happens here is that it's first things first. Make sure that we have a roof over our head, we've got bread and everything else, and then later technology will become the next thing that we're thinking, is this something that we really, really want? But we prioritize bread and butter issues before we can think of the technology use and accessing it. What the World Economic Forum report also tells us that it's important that there ought to be relevant content in order for users to engage with it. Now, with 80% of online content is only available to one of 10 languages, which only about 3 billion people speak as their own. What we know here is that 55% of websites are actually in English as the primary language. Also understanding that across the continent, there are other languages that are being spoken as first languages before English. So if the bulk of the content is available in English, this on its own might serve as a barrier to engaging with the content that is available. So what this World Economic Forum tells us is that achieving Internet for all will require an integrated ecosystem. One, making sure that we've got the right infrastructure that is on the ground, making sure that people are skilled to use the technologies. There's an awareness drive that's on the ground to make sure that people are actually aware of the technologies that are actually available. And again, the issue of affordability. If consumers cannot afford the technology, they will not use the technology. And the content has got to be relevant and has got to be adapted locally. While in pursuit on making sure that citizens are actually able to utilize this technology, we have to be mindful that there are connectivity barriers or bottlenecks. Now, bridging the online and offline world, 90% of Africa's populations remains off the grid, and hence the agency to improve internet access by closing the mobile internet. I mentioned earlier on that, yes, citizens might have access to mobile handsets. However, the majority do not have access to smart mobile handsets, which will serve as a conduit to utilizing the internet. So one of the other connectivity barriers is the cost to communicate. Affordability is a key issue affecting internet access, uptake, and also usage. Constraints are also caused by the high cost of devices, the limited relevance of content, and lack of digital literacy. And sometimes you find that internet services are simply not available in other areas. When looking at literacy levels, literacy has risen to prominence both as a human resource issue and an equity issue. What governments are working on now is making sure that literacy levels are increased, making sure that their citizens have access to basic education and thus getting basic literacy education. So literacy, unless this is addressed, literacy challenges remain in spite of the constant evolution and morphing technologies. So as technologies evolve, we still have communities who remain illiterate. So basic illiteracy, digital illiteracy, and lack of internet awareness are among the consumer barriers to the internet adoption. And when looking at language, I did indicate earlier on that the bulk of the websites are actually in English as the primary language, which actually cut out the majority of the users. Another literacy levels is that there has got to be a heavy investment in making sure that citizens are being upskilled, not only to learn how to read and write, but they're also being upskilled to know how to use the technologies. And then the biggest other barrier is the infrastructure deployment. Currently, there's inadequate investment and development in core infrastructure. So we know that we have bottlenecks, and we also know that we have connectivity barriers, but the aim is to make sure that citizens have access to digital connectivity. So we have stakeholders who have come on board in a form of public-private partnerships, and they've made sure that they run campaigns, they avail training on the ground, and they push awareness programs to make sure that people are aware about the technologies that are available, and also ensuring that they are able to access the very same technologies. There are a number of programs which are on the ground, like, for instance, we have the World Economic Forum, which is pushing the Internet for All program, which has been rolled out in Africa. I know for a fact that it was launched in South Africa. The program is also up and running in Rwanda and also Kenya, just to name the few countries within the African continent. We also have another initiative which is being driven by Microsoft called 1 Million Youth Project, whose sole purpose is to make sure that youth gets training to be able to utilize the technology, the devices, even to train them to become software developers. Facebook also, on the other hand, has got what they call code.org. There are other examples which are also taking place on the ground. We know that, for instance, GSMA runs what they call the GSMA Connected Women Program, which is primarily focused on increasing women's access to and the use of life-enhancing mobile services, and also closing the digital skills gender gap. MTN in Uganda also runs what they call the MTN Regional Internet Expos. What they tend to do with these expos is that they're showcasing their data and products and services directly to consumers. So consumers are able to touch, feel, and experience the services that are being provided by the mobile service provider. So they use the technologies, they know how to navigate through the mobile device, and the services which are being offered by the various interactive platforms, they are also able to utilize those. Whilst technologies are morphing and we are with the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, we've got to make sure that we do not create new digital divides. So we have to ensure that there's reduction of prices. We have got to also make sure that we have sufficient digital awareness interventions to make sure that there's uptake and also to encourage usage. But most importantly, especially within the developing world, is to make sure that there is support for universal service and access to promote internet uptake by disadvantaged communities in underserviced areas. Promotion of digital literacy and training programs and the development of e-learning-based local and localized content and services also remains key. But how do we make sure that we are able to bridge the digital divide? How do we make sure that consumers or citizens have got access to the use of services, this is where policy, regulatory, and governance steps in. Policy is at the heart of everything that many countries and governments does. And when you're looking at regulatory is the main lever by which governments can influence competition in any given market. And when looking at governance, we just do not look at just governance, but we look at governance which is associated with efficient and effective administration in a democratic framework. Good governance goes hand in hand with accountability. Good governance goes hand in hand with transparency, and good governance goes hand in hand with making sure that we combat corruption. When there's corruption in any countries, it does not invite investors to come and invest in those particular countries. So good governance also remains a key and an important for governments and for countries to make sure that they also attract investments. So from a policy, regulatory, and governance perspective, there has got to be a consciously integrated, conducive policy, regulatory, and governance framework. And to make sure that we have an effective ICT environment, it requires both policy and regulatory certainty and a forward-looking approach. Public policy is also essential for the success of building digital economies and also for encouraging digital innovation. Strong government and policy involvement is required in order to make sure that we are able to shape the digital future and the economy. It is also critical that political institutions remain stable and are also very supportive of the sector and thus the economy. There ought to be policy-led initiatives in order to drive innovation. So in many instances, governments have got to create policy directions which clearly articulate what their plans are for the future. This way, industry is therefore able to respond to all these plans that government is seeking to drive. Sensible regulation is also required that will keep pace with the transforming digital planet. We also require regulations that have a dynamic view of protecting consumer interests. It is also crucial that we have infrastructural policy solutions that ensure that the rural communities remain connected. So when looking into the future, what kind of a future should we anticipate? The UN Broadband Council report suggests that 3.6 billion will be connected to the internet. However, we will still have others who will not or who will remain unconnected across the continent. On the other hand, we also have the African Union's Agenda 2063 framework document, which suggests that the continent must invest in Africa's most precious resources, which is its people. Now, this talks to the training of people, upskilling of people, and making sure that the citizens are able to utilize the technologies that have been made available. So we have a myriad and a big number of organizations whose core interest is to make sure that we have more people coming online onto the grid and making sure that they, once connected, they remain connected. But the biggest task is more than just getting the unconnected online, but to make sure that those who are online do actually remain online. The use of technology to serve humanity better, ensure social inclusion by bridging are indicated that we use technology as an enabler. So technology is there to humanity better, to ensure that there's social inclusion by bridging the digital divide. However, we ought to make sure that lowering the cost to communicate does actually take place. We also need to make sure that there is an availability of affordable devices and make sure that government supports the promotion of illiteracy awareness initiatives. But this they will not do on their own, as I've already indicated earlier on, that we do have companies who have come on board, who are also driving their own campaigns to ensure that there's awareness and there's also digital literacy. Now, the challenge across the continent where there is no availability of electricity, for instance, you find that people might have their mobile handsets, but those handsets, they need to be charged. So if there's no electricity, then it means that people will not be able to use those mobile handsets, and thus they'll be shut out from utilizing that technology that might be available. The biggest concern, again, is that from many African governments is that Africa is, as a continent, is just seen as a market. Hence, Africa needs to narrate its own journey by making sure that there's local manufacturing taking place, and this will ensure that there's future economic growth. And the continent also needs to reduce the continent's dependence on important communications hardware. And Africa has got to invest in infrastructure, and also in accordance with the African Union infrastructure projects. Effective, smart policy and regulations are crucial, and they will play a major role in shaping the digital industry and its market attractiveness, integrated into overall national development plans and goals. And these are clearly articulated by governments via policy. In conclusion, policymakers' low-hanging fruits to boost ICT use must ensure that countries build ICT readiness by looking at long-term costly investment in infrastructure and in education, ensure that sound regulations will result in more intense competition and thus bring the cost down. And this could be cost of devices, this could be cost of data, or any other tariffs. Unless this is done, beyond the mobile telephone access, the digital divide will continue to run deep.
Thank you very much for sharing your expert knowledge and insight with us today, Nomonde. It was wonderful having you. Thank you very much. Thank you, too, to all our attendees today. Thank you for tuning in and taking a look at this as well as our week-long agenda of online events. If you would like to continue the discussion, check out connectingafrica.com for all your latest news and industry developments, as well as at Connect Africa on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And why not join us for the 20th anniversary of AfricaCom this November in Cape Town? It's 3 days of content, 400 speakers, and 450 exhibitors over 2 exhibition halls. We're mapping Africa's journey towards the 4th Industrial Revolution. See you again next time for another Digital Week webinar. Goodbye.